I'm Lisa Gardenier. I'm the Curator of International Literature for the University of Iowa Libraries. I've been at the University of Iowa for 12 years. They hired me to be the Latin American Iberian Studies Librarian in 2012, and in that time, my job has shifted and changed as people have come and gone until I am now responsible for a lot more than Latin America. I'm responsible for also African studies, Middle Eastern studies, South Asian studies, and Russian. I'm also the primary library liaison to the International Writing Program, as well as also the MFA in Literary Translation. And so that would explain why you're talking to me today.
It's good that you started by explaining that. Now I don't have to. But yeah, you've been working with us at the International Writing Program. Has that essentially been since you started in 2012?
Pretty much. So my first IWP residency and really my introduction to IWP would have been fall of 2012. At that point, I was working with almost exclusively writers working in Spanish and Portuguese. I remember that year there were 5. And I basically showed a lot of interest in it that the librarian who was kind of, but not really officially the liaison at the time was basically just like, sure, go ahead, do this.
This can be your thing now.
Yeah. And that was Chiaki Sakai, who was our previous Japanese studies librarian, and she's now at Columbia University. But so for the next couple of years, her and I worked pretty closely together. But she increasingly encouraged me to take lead on that, which I mean it's become a lot of fun, and it's been a really interesting, probably really one of the most interesting parts of my job for the past decade.
Yeah, so I want to go back to a couple of things that you said because they were interesting to me. And so the first one is when you say that you're responsible for an area, what does that mean?
Generally, at its most basic, collections and services. So, for example, the program that I've been working with the absolute longest is the and Portuguese department and the MFA in Spanish creative writing. I have to know a department. I have to know who the faculty are on that. I have to know what their research interests are. I have to know what they teach. I might be on call to do instruction for a class. There's a class on, could be colonial Latin America, it could be contemporary literature, but they need to have their students access that information. And at its most basic, I always tell students, because getting into the nitty gritty weeds of my job isn't really interesting to undergraduates. So I'm like, my job is to connect you to information. That is what I do.
Hmm.
Whether that information is literally buying a book and putting it on the shelf, or whether it is telling you how to access government information from Colombia. I can do any of that. It gets harder when you add on areas that I'm less familiar with. My academic training is in Latin American studies. Is it ideal to have your Latin American studies librarian taking care of your South Asian collection? Probably not, but we do it anyway. It works out, I think.
Yeah.
And I guess I've kind of accumulated other international areas in that I don't necessarily expect information to come from the ways that you expect as an American. You have certain expectations of the information that you can get from your government, of how you buy a book, of
Yeah.
how you access academic information. Some of that it holds true in other countries. Sometimes it very much does not. Um,
Right. So for example, in the US, and this is me guessing what sort of
yeah,
issues you might run
sure.
into. So you tell me where I'm wrong and what the actual problem is. But one that immediately comes to mind is in the US, even if you are a tiny independent publisher, it is usually the case that if you're on top of your game, you are getting an ISBN and
Yeah.
that is available to help people track your publications, and everybody can index by that. I'm guessing that sort of thing is not universally practiced.
Close to universal, but
Okay.
not quite. There are some countries that I've found that ISBNs seem to have not quite caught on.
Right.
Burma is one, and that's one that I have to work with through IWP. We've had like what, maybe 20 writers, Burmese writers
Yeah.
over the whole 55 plus years of IWP. I have found that Burmese books often do not come with an ISBN. There are very few countries, but there are a few that
Mhm.
don't really do it. But yeah, generally, that is one of the more closer to universal ones.
That's good.
And I swear Natasha and I could probably put together like the best random trivia of IWP and international publishing
Yeah.
possible and make it pretty brutal.
Yeah.
Which country does not use an ISBN?
It's Burma.
Yeah.
What is some of the other trivia?
Oh, probably some really weird stuff about like old writers who've come and gone and
Mhm.
whatnot. Some of it would delve into gossip and
Okay.
some of it.
Well, we won't. So far, we've avoided that hazard in the podcast. But
Yeah.
you
I
know,
could do things like what book did Orhan Pamuk write while in Iowa?
what book did he write while in Iowa?
The Black Book. Uh,
Okay.
does it have more of a title than that? I can't
I
recall.
don't think so.
Yeah.
I think
Okay.
that's right.
Yeah. But yeah, so there are some things that it's like, oh yeah, we know exactly what they were doing, or there was a writer in 2012 who wrote a book about Bob Dylan and went up to Hibbing, Minnesota.
Right.
So things like that.
It's convenient for those purposes when they write a book about their Iowa
Oh
experience,
yeah.
because then it's like, okay, I do know what they were doing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
At
Yeah.
least
Oh
they were
yeah.
thinking about it.
Thank you for documenting this very carefully.
Yeah, exactly. What are some of the other challenges that you run into in building a robust international collection? Because to share my impression, and
Yeah.
you can tell me if this is wrong, my sense is that, I mean, one, like before you come to work in a context like this, you might not have assumptions one way or the other about what the availability of international literature in a library at a university would be. But like once I was here and I was thinking about it, I think that I had unrealistically high expectations of what was achievable. Right. I would have thought that availability for a lot of these things is probably a lot higher than it is. So I'm curious, like, how would you summarize the sort of state of the challenges of building an international collection that suits what your goals are, and what are some places where you feel like we really excel, or you really excel in getting the things that you're looking for?
It differs by library and university and budget. There are some universities like Harvard who they don't necessarily have all the money in the world, but they do have a lot more money than Iowa, and they can definitely put a lot more resources into getting as much as they can.
Right.
In our case, we tend to focus on the languages that we teach, which actually for a Big Ten university is not a whole lot.
Right.
It's like, I think we're at like around 10 or 12 languages on campus.
That feels right.
Yeah. There are other universities like Indiana or Illinois that teach literally dozens. So we actively collect in those areas and according to kind of size of the program. So our collection for Spanish is a lot larger than our collection for Swahili,
Hmm.
which we do teach.
Right.
And we do collect in Swahili actively. And when I say actively, to get into the weeds a little bit, that's going to vendors and often telling them, hey, we have a budget of so many dollars, and this is what our university is interested in. Send us material according to those interests and to that, that the budget. And that can only get you so far sometimes.
Right.
So sometimes, maybe a $2,000 budget is totally adequate for Swahili, but is not going to get you very far at all in Spanish. You might, a $200,000 budget would be a very, and we don't have a $200,000 budget for
Right.
Spanish, but, that would be like, wow, what could I do with that?
Right.
But that said, then we go into within that, what do we need? So we have very different needs for the Spanish budget, which serves an MFA, versus for other languages that have a more traditional program that doesn't focus necessarily on creative writing, but are a more traditional historical literature type program.
Right. So for the Spanish collection, we might be focusing more on novels, poetry, things that are going to be used as model texts for the writers and
Yeah.
perhaps taught in their classes, things like that.
And even that, I push ours pretty heavily into like independent presses that are not going to get collected by other libraries. Grinnell College is for a small liberal arts college, probably has a very good Spanish collection, but they're going to have largely a collection, or not picking on Grinnell necessarily, but any other well-funded small liberal arts college with a healthy Spanish program is probably going to have a pretty good collection of the major presses, new literature that's coming out, but they aren't going to go too deep into independent publishing.
Hmm.
That's where I push us even more than another large research university library without a Spanish MFA, because our students are early career writers and they often want to know who their peers are
Hmm.
and where do their peers publish?
Right.
Where will they likely publish?
Yeah.
A handful of them do publish with the major presses in the Spanish language world, but a lot of them publish with small independent presses. I want them to be able to see that on the shelf
Right.
and know. And some of them I've seen students go into the stacks for the first time, and most of, for example, the Spanish MFA, most of them are from Spanish speaking countries. Only very few have come from within the U.S.
Right.
And I've seen them actually go in and go like, "Oh, I studied with that. I took a workshop with that guy," or "That's one of my friends. I went to college with her." And that's a pretty cool moment to have. So it's also, so you're going to have very different expectations of what can we get when it's Spanish versus another language.
Right.
We do collect in other languages that we don't teach, but we do a much more focused collection, and it's usually based around IWP or very specific requests.
Right. So that was another
Yeah.
thing I wanted to ask about was we have, and I've only been around here for a couple of years, so maybe you can tell me if this is something that's changed over the years. But like last year, for example, there were a series of photos that came from our different fall residency participants as they went into the stacks, often with you, I think, sometimes with
I
other
think those
folks.
came from mostly from the library orientation.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And in many cases we see them holding copies of their own books.
Yeah. So some of them, well, and especially those ones were writers in those languages that we teach on campus.
Yes.
It would be pretty rare for us to get a writer from who works in a language that we don't teach on campus, and for them to find their own book in the stacks.
Hmm.
Not saying that it can't happen, just that it's probably not going to.
Right.
But I can take a writer from Latin America into the stacks, and we will probably find something from them, unless they are just about to put out their first book
Right.
ever.
Right.
And writers who work in English, that's pretty easy. We do collect Anglophone literature from around the world, from Africa, from South Asia, especially, and yeah. So you're going to, and a lot of those have incredibly robust publishing markets. So the publishing market in English in India is massive,
Right.
and we're only scratching the surface of that. So yeah.
So to go back a little bit, I wanted to ask about how you made the decision or found yourself in the position of studying to be a librarian in the first place.
Yeah, this was ancient history. So as I was finishing my undergraduate degree is in international relations and in Spanish, which is also to tell you that I don't really have that much of an academic background in literature.
Sure.
My academic background is much more in social sciences. And I was taking Spanish not necessarily to learn the beauty of Cervantes, but to learn about the social and historical issues around a subject that I was very interested in. And as I was finishing undergrad, I was going like, okay, great, what do I do with my life now? Instead of writing a final paper, I was like up, thinking like, crap, now what? Uh, and so I thought about a couple of other possible degrees. I knew that I wanted to go on for a master's in Latin American studies. I just also wasn't really confident in its ability to keep me stably employed for life.
That's fair. I don't know that market too well in terms of the prospects, but I'm not assuming that it's easy to like.
Yeah.
There's just a job waiting for you when you get done
Right,
with that.
right, right. And then, like, I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do or specialize within that. So I decided I had to get a professional degree.
Yeah.
Eventually, I landed on library science it was an off the cuff remark from a friend who had come out of a meeting where, like, I think a librarian was a faculty. Advisor for a student organization or something. He was like, some of the librarians on this campus are the coolest faculty on campus. And I was like, light bulb moment.
I could be one of the coolest faculty on campus.
Not that we are faculty at Iowa, but
Yeah,
you know
yeah.
that's fine. But yeah, that was basically the process of it, and I told myself I had to go to library school first. So
Yeah. It's an interesting dynamic. There's sort of been in my time since undergrad, grad school and now living in the professional world where I feel like sometimes word is going around that libraries are that's the way to go, right? If you're a person like
yeah,
me or you who is interested in reading and interested in just the world generally and you're not quite sure what your professional path should be, the library is a great way to get a stable job that you'll enjoy doing that maybe pays okay. And then I
yeah.
feel like and the teeter happens and then the totter of like enough people hear that rumor that the school fills up and then word goes around that actually it's a very competitive job market and you don't necessarily want to get in there unless you're really serious about it. So there's like this evangelism and counter evangelism that seems to happen cyclically around the profession. I don't know is that your experience? Like, how have you seen that sort of evolve?
So how much have you thought about going to library school? Because yeah, you nailed that.
I have not gone. I've never considered it seriously myself because I think I would. The moment where I was vulnerable to that pitch was when we were in one of the cycles where it was very competitive and people did not think that it
Yeah.
was easy to get in there. This would have been around, and this might be regional, right? I was living in New Mexico getting my graduate degree at the time, but like I remember having those conversations in 2010, 2011 when I was getting my MFA and finishing it up.
Yeah, 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 and that is basically it is regional. There are certain metro areas that have like Chicago is ringed by library schools, and so like Chicago is a very very competitive market for folks who want to be
Yeah.
librarians. Other places less so, but you know I had and God, this was my very first professional job out of library school. Was I worked at a community college in Arizona, and one of my colleagues there had been a software engineer, and he had worked for like almost every Fortune 500 company that had a presence in Phoenix. And but he was on call overnights, and sometimes he worked the graveyard shift, and he was burning out. And he heard an NPR story of that libraries needed more tech oriented
Ah.
people. So yeah, and you know, he's continued on in community colleges, and you know, I remember him being like, you know, you guys are never going to call me at 3 o'clock in the morning. This is great. I'll take a
Yeah.
pay cut. I am never going to be working the overnight shift. The worst you guys can do to me is basically call me on my vacation and say, "Hey, we can't do something," and he'll fix it in 15 minutes and go back to his vacation. So there are certain benefits to, you know, working in libraries and that they tend to usually be not the most high stress jobs. Um, they do not necessarily pay the best, but you can make a, you know, a comfortable living off of
Right.
it. Would I like more money? Always,
Yeah,
sure.
sure. I would
Yeah, I
also.
know, right? Who doesn't? But I'm pretty good with that.
Yeah.
So,
There is sometimes I have felt an evangelical quality to not every library, but to some librarians, right? Like I have a friend who um if you date her, the odds of getting a master's degree and being qualified to work as a librarian, they aren't low. Like it seems to spread.
the an MLS might be a contagious condition.
But I mean, it's of all the things to catch, right? Like, at
You could do worse.
it's at least benign. Like, these people aren't worse off for those
Right.
degrees. I don't know if they're all better off, but I mean, if nothing else, it's got to be, I bet it's a fun program to be in for a couple years.
Yeah, I mean, and geez, I graduated from library school in 2008. So it's been a while, and library school has changed since I've been there. Um but yeah, it's as far as graduate programs, it's not a particularly difficult one in the
Hmm.
coursework.
Right.
The thing is with libraries and getting a job in libraries is they're looking more at the experience, and nobody cares for example, Columbia University and University of Chicago, both of those used to have library schools. They closed them in the 90s when they felt, I don't know, it was going the way of the dodo or whatever. But nobody really looks at a library degree for what university it came from.
Sure.
They're looking at what work experience and what experience you gained from the courses. So the actual brand name on your certificate does not really matter. It's more about the work that you do. And that's different at different schools. So in my case, I went to Indiana for library school. They didn't have a lot of graduate assistantships, but they had a load of student hourly positions. And I worked in about 5 different departments in the library and the university library system there because I wanted to know how things got done and get different experience and everything. So,
Yeah, I feel like that is an underrated aspect of a lot of academic careers in the humanities and social sciences, et cetera, is, like I have the career that I have because of everything I did other than my MFA while I was getting my MFA, right? It was because I worked as a managing editor for a literary magazine. It was because of the like design work that I did and editing and stuff like it was everything but the degree that actually determined what my professional life was going to be like. And that, like, it sounds obvious once you say it, but like, it's frustrating because there's a lot of anxiety, I think, with a lot of these jobs. Maybe again, it teeter totters with librarians, how much anxiety there is. But like when people are saying like, "What is the job that you're going to get with your MFA in creative writing?" It's like, well, the MFA in creative writing is not actually the answer to that question. It's everything that happens around the degree that
yeah,
answers the question of what you're going to end up doing.
yeah.
So I know from our conversations in advance of this interview that you are the co-editor of a book that is under contract to come out. Is it coming out this year or next year?
I don't have an updated deadline or timeline on it. It's probably coming out by the end of the year.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, and it's called Comunidad Letrada, Lettered Community, Alternative and Independent Publishing in Latin America with Litwin Books.
yep, that's correct.
How did you come to be a co-editor on this book with your colleagues? How did this book first come together?
It's a pandemic project. It is my final pandemic project that is wrapping up. We're actually in the middle of copy edits as we're recording this. So I've going back to talking about, how I approach the collection in support of an MFA, and I focus a lot on independent publishing. I've been just really amazed at the breadth of publishing in Latin America. And that varies by country. Like Argentina is an absolute powerhouse. Chile punches way above its weight. It looks a little different in every country. And that a lot of the most interesting work comes out in independent publishing, independent presses. So I've been working with this and kind of dipping my toe into those waters for a while, like going to book fairs focus on independent presses, or if I'm going to a large national mainstream book fair, finding where that stuff is and where I can get it that's not necessarily in the book fair itself, talking to the publishers who are often selling their own books from those stands, and just realizing just what a world that is. And so again, as we're all going mad in, early mid 2020,
I remember that feeling of
I should be doing something.
yeah,
I'm not
surely something should be happening right now.
right. I had had this idea for a while, and I brought it up to my colleague David Woken at the University of Chicago and bounced it off of him. And of course, he's also in that same pandemic madness of sure, that sounds like a great idea. Let's do this.
Anything.
Right. And we bring in another colleague, Mark Delkin, who is a publisher based in Chiapas, Mexico. And so he's the one actually doing the work of publishing, and we're the librarians who are just like, well, this is interesting and this is great stuff. And so yeah, David and I approached Mark. He was like, yeah, sure, I'd love to work with you guys. We kind of brainstormed. We wanted it to be a bit more informal than an academic monograph. And we wanted, if we could, to get material from publishers Whether that was something like maybe like a even a manifesto or something that they had read that they had written up describing this is what I do and why I do it. In the academic world, you have encouragements and rewards for writing academically
Hmm.
that do not exist if you are a small independent publisher who needs to pay your bills.
Right.
So we can't expect that sort of chapter to come out of somebody who is actively trying to edit books, design covers, market their books, and do everything all at once. But maybe they'd already written something, or maybe they had something in mind that they've been dying to write anyway, or whatever. So that's basically how the book came about. And so it is a mix of we have some librarians in the US. The purpose of the book is Litwin Books is a publisher that is focused on actually library professional publications,
Hmm.
well respected in our field. They're interested in covering topics that often fall a little bit outside of the academic publishing model, and so ours was a good fit for them. And basically put together the proposal, sent it out, have this interesting mix of stuff written by librarians. And so the idea is to also show other librarians that this stuff has value,
Hmm.
because a lot of independent literature, like I mentioned before, with like small liberal arts colleges, might have a very good Spanish collection, but they don't go very deep into independent literature,
Right.
independent presses. Whereas like University of Iowa, even though we have maybe half the library that University of Chicago does, we punch above our weight in literature,
Hmm.
as we do the library does, and every other program that has anything to do with literature on this campus does.
Right.
So it's a situation in which I this is one thing that I focus on, and I focus on with laser attention.
Hmm.
Yeah, that is where this comes from. That's a mix of librarians writing as to this is why we do this, and this is what the benefit is to have this in our collection, and publishers explaining this is what we do, this is why we do it, and this is the literature, not even just literature, but this is the material that we provide.
Well, it sounds really interesting. You shared the introduction with me, so I have a little bit of a sense of what is going on inside the book. And there's a discussion of this idea of constant hustle, right? That
Yeah.
there are, as you sort of alluded to, there are publishers working at all different levels and with various different goals and with various depending on where they are and all sorts of different contextual considerations, like they might have access to markets in different ways or different kinds of markets. So there's a discussion in that introduction of the constant hustle aspect of this work. And I'm curious in connection to that and just generally, like, what are some interesting things that you learned in the process of editing this book or in the lead up to it? What are some things about that hustle that have struck you?
A lot of that actually came before doing the book and my interactions with publishers, whether that be in book fairs or other, or, bookstores even, and talking to like small bookstore, the Prairie Lights of, you name it, city in South America. Um, and seeing, the work that they have to put into that. And so a lot of the book is kind of like capturing that. I think there are some folks like one of my favorite. I'm not gonna. Okay, I can't play favorites on the chapters in the book,
Okay.
but one that I really appreciate is the what's effectively the epilogue of the book, and it's a publisher and bookstore owner in Mexico, and he discusses reading the city as a text and how basically the world is our texts around him and the information that you gather from the life around you. And it's just this really beautiful thing that I it's the closest that I've ever come to seeing of how I experience walking around a city or whether that's Iowa City and the place that I live, or the place that I grew up in near Syracuse, New York, or a new city that I've never visited before. So there's a lot of talk about. I think it's a lot of it is that people have kind of put, and this doesn't really get to the hustle of it, but a lot of people have put into words things that I have just kind of had in this nebulous, wordless form in my mind, and
Mhm.
I'm finally like, oh my god, I totally get that.
Yeah.
So it was lovely to have the pitch for that chapter just kind of show up, and I'm like, "Oh, I get that. Yeah,
Yeah.
you got it. We're good. Please write out whatever you want." But, I'll try and think of an example of this sort of hustle that I've seen, without necessarily like putting a name or face to it. Because I don't know who I want to talk about,
Sure.
or if I have like,
Sure. Sure.
but I guess when I've met folks at book fairs, for example, and for that week they're working a book fair, and that might be a 12, 14-hour day because they have to come up, set up their table, and they're there for the whole day. They're lucky if they can talk to their neighbor stand and say, "Hey man, can you watch my stand while I go to the bathroom and grab a quick lunch maybe?"
Right.
They're there for the whole day. They don't really have a lot of backup. And next week, once they tear down the stand and once they, count their money for, what they made for the week, how much they spent on hotel and everything, they then go right back to editing, chasing down authors to either sign new contracts. And while they're also doing the stand, they're also probably meeting authors
Right.
and trying to do all of these things at once. They might also have their laptop open and are working on edits or whatever, in the middle of it, or just getting a slice of that life. When I've seen it happen at book fairs, I'm just like, I couldn't do that. I guess the other thing I've learned also in the process of editing a book, I don't like editing. So
Now you know.
I certainly know. I've learned this in this like pandemic madness project, and I will probably it's not even out yet, and I'll probably never do it again. So yeah.
It is definitely unlike just about anything else. Everything is unlike anything else, and so is this.
Yeah. Yeah, and I have great attention for detail. That
Yeah.
is not the problem. I don't really like the I guess the manner of the attention detail that editing requires. Whereas like if you need me to chase down some random book out of I don't know where, yeah, I'll do that. I'll figure out how to get it.
Yeah.
That's no problem. And then figuring out how to arrange it all in the library, cool, we're good. But don't ask me to edit a book again. So
Okay, I won't.
the guys have been great to work with. They probably have not been so impressed with me so far.
Oh, no. So the last section of the book focuses on the phenomenon of cartonera publishing.
Okay, yeah.
And I'm interested. Could you just describe what that is for the listener and summarize a little bit about what the book has to say about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So cartonera publishing is cardboard, and carton in Spanish is cardboard.
Right.
And these are books that are bound in cardboard, just like that box sitting over there. And it could be not that box, but it could be a Frito-Lay's potato chip case.
Right.
And you see that in the book as well, that okay, this thing came out of a case of wine. All right, cool. This it's something that I've been aware of for pretty much as long as I've been at Iowa.
Hmm.
There's a great collection of cartoneta books. It's a phenomenon that came out of Latin America and specifically out of Argentina. One of the best collections in the world is at the University of Wisconsin. And they've got, I think, I don't know, probably 1,500, 2,000 of them by now.
Wow.
Yeah. We've got probably like 300.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to go check one of these out.
They're really neat. And actually, so we do something interesting with them at Iowa is that we let about half of them circulate.
Oh wow.
And basically, as long as it can, in my estimation, survive like an interlibrary loan transaction, as in, could I ship this thing out to California and get it back in one piece? Then I let it circulate unless I have a good reason, like there's no other copies in the US, or, it's an IWP author, and we do have some that are, then those ones go into special collections. Like,
Right.
okay, this is the only copy in the US. I'm not going to trust it to go out to California and back, even if it
Right.
could survive it intact. So this comes out of Argentina in the economic and political crisis that they had at the end of 2001. They defaulted on some major IMF or World Bank, sorry, I can't remember which, loans, which sent the country into a political tailspin, and an economic tailspin. The publishing market, of course, suffered, but some folks kind of realized, like, hey, we can still put out books if we basically turn it into an art project.
Hmm.
So they do a very cheap text block, often just coming out of a, you know, standard computer printer or Xeroxed.
Right.
They're usually staple bound and usually put into just then a cardboard wrapper
Yeah.
for binding that is then hand painted or otherwise decorated usually. Some of them are gorgeous. I think actually the most beautiful one I've ever bought was actually somewhat recently. I was at the Guadalajara Book Fair in Mexico, and there's a bookstore there that I know that provides cartonera books, and it is a history of punk in Guadalajara. And it is just a gorgeous cover, and it's hand stitched, and the cover is still cardboard. That one is in special collections. That one I'm not trusting to go out and
Yeah.
into the world. But there are others that are just like there's some paint slapped on it, and there's like a Sharpie that puts the title on it, and great, you have a book. And you can sell it off of a blanket on the street side or in a market or whatever for real cheap. And somebody can say, like, yeah, I would like, a pound, a kilo of tomatoes and that book.
A
Thank you.
kilo of book.
Yeah, yeah, right.
How long are they usually? Like how many pages
They're
roughly?
usually shorter.
Yeah.
So it's not uncommon to see it as kind of like a collection of poetry or a short collection of short stories or even like a short novella.
Hmm.
They usually don't go much beyond, say, 50 to 70 pages,
Uh-huh.
seems to be pretty typical of them. I have seen some that are longer. They then usually have to take some reinforcements on the binding because, the Frito Lay's box is not going to hold up to that. So,
That makes sense.
yeah.
I'm always interested, and maybe there's no answer to this, but I'm always interested in how the market conditions and working conditions affect how writers choose to approach writing. I'm curious if there is a if there are a couple like clear themes in terms of like what differentiates the content of these sorts of books from other, maybe even from like from a chat book in the same market, right? Something that
Yeah.
has the more traditional binding. Like, is there anything that stands out as different about them?
Yes and no. So, for example, the Argentine writer Cesar Aira publishes actually quite a bit in Cartonera. He is known as somebody that Cartonera press can say, "Hey, man, do you have like I don't know a unpublished short story that?" And he'll be like, "Yeah, sure, have it." So there are some quite notable writers who do occasionally pitch short pieces off to Cartonera presses, and sometimes they let that be, okay, this Cartoneta press in Argentina can use it, and then this one in Peru can have the same story because they aren't
Hmm.
often distributed very far
Right.
or very well. But some of them do. The guy down the street just wrote a short novella of a police novel or whatever. Sure, go ahead, publish it.
Right.
So in some ways, it does bring down it lowers a lot of barriers to publishing. And sure, maybe nobody else outside of that neighborhood would be interested in this dude's story. But here it is, and his neighbors can read it.
Yeah. A neighborhood is a totally valid market in which to be operating.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it brings that into it. Part of why it has such a presence in the book more than other forms of alternative publishing is our co-editor Mark.
Hmm.
And he has been a Cartonetta publisher before.
Yeah.
I I don't think he's doing it quite as much as he has in the past, but yeah, he can throw together a book in a very short amount of time.
Yeah.
He's the efficient one on the team.
Right. That's it. It's
Yeah.
interesting to me that it is a thing that has publishers because, in all honesty, when
Yeah.
you were describing that, my brain went to this is self publishing, right? Like that
Yeah.
was the
Yeah.
model that and I'm sure that that's in the mix
It
too.
is. Yeah.
But it sounds like it's maybe more like this is a way that, people who are establishing something of an institution, they're
Yeah.
choosing to do this too.
And it can also of course have a very political bent to it. And obviously when you're trying to make literature as accessible as possible, like you are literally selling your book next to a stand selling potatoes.
Right.
There is sometimes it is literature and sometimes it can also be like political essays
Hmm.
and such, or it can be a history of punk. So it can be whatever it is, and I've seen quite a breadth of it. I've seen some cartoonettos, of course they get like insanely creative. They aren't bound by that traditional market. I have seen one that is a Cartonetta coloring book, and it had, those like really cheap packs of crayons that are like more wax than pigment. It had one of those like pasted to the cover.
Yeah.
So, I mean, how else are you gonna see that? You aren't gonna see, I don't know what's the mainstream market for coloring books, but when we went through that coloring book phase, also in the pandemic, um,
Yes.
you know, yeah, they weren't doing it quite that way.
No, no, they
Yeah,
weren't.
yeah. There are children's books, there are comics that all come out in this sort of, yeah. It's very much a framework of bringing the content in a very accessible way to the people of your community.
Yeah. I've been debating whether there was a way to phrase this as like an interesting or productive question, but I'll just try saying it and then we'll see if there's
Right.
anything more to say about it. But something I think about sometimes with writing is that it feels to me like there is a real distortion in the field and what is considered possible in the field and what people do with it because there is not in the US community level publishing is mostly not done, right? There are exceptions, but like if you're doing other forms, right? If you are a musician, if you are an artist, there are usually ways in which you can produce art that is of interest to your local community, but nobody is like going to do local literature in the same way. Like
Yeah.
it's such a rare thing and I feel like it really distorts the kinds of things that we make art about that you don't write fiction about the same sorts of things you might make that locally oriented music or art again I don't know what a question is here to say but it's a thing that I think about
It is that is a really interesting observation because, like, the musical equivalent of Cartonetta would be like going to see the Friday concerts on the Ped Mall
right
or going to a house show for
yeah
for a punk band or something.
yeah
And that is very much where the space that Cartonetta is in of just like, you want music? All right, we're gonna throw down and bust out our instruments and you're gonna listen and it's gonna be a good night.
right
You know?
exactly and like you can do an open mic if you
Yeah.
want but
Yeah.
like it's a punishment to go to them right like
You said that, I did not.
and I'll host these things, right?
Yeah.
Like I am sometimes professionally obligated to host them and to persuade people to go to them. And I do think it's a good thing to do because it's the closest thing that we have to this niche that I do think should exist. But like it's not considered good. Like it's
It's, and Iowa City probably has the closest to a local literary market that I've ever seen
yeah.
because it is part of our cultural and social fabric to, if you're at all in contact with the literature community here, with the writing community, that, yeah, you do show up for readings and open mic
Yeah.
nights, whether
Yeah.
you want to or not. I I tend to enjoy them, the ones that I show up to.
Yeah, yeah, you gotta be selective. Well, and it's funny
Yeah.
to hear too because like this is a place where on the one hand people consider it like socially necessary to pretend to be impressed when you tell them you're a published writer. Like people here pretend to be interested in the fact that I have books published in a way that they don't anywhere else in the country. But that doesn't mean they actually want to hear about it. Like it's not like people here like because there's so many writers here that have careers, well above and beyond mine. Like nobody actually wants to talk about it. But they have to pretend to.
Right, yeah, yeah. There are some interesting things about Iowa City like that.
Just any given party that you go to, the odds are decent, especially if you're, university connected socially. Like
Yeah.
there's just going to be writers there, and it'll be what it is.
It's what I like about being kind of more on the periphery of that, as,
Yeah,
like, I do not consider myself a writer, and I have not, except for this book that I'm working that is about to come out, I'm not published
yeah,
really, so I've done a couple academic articles or whatever, but so that is kinda nice for me that I don't have to play that game
yeah,
really.
yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't really matter, like, I don't have anything to tell you about what I've published really, so
So in 2022, which was my first year actually working at the IWP, you and Natasha Dorovicheva, our recently retired editor, who is still here,
Yeah.
retired and still like sometimes she's in a Zoom meeting and I'm like, and her camera will often be off, and so it's like, are we being surveilled? What is your planned level of participation in this meeting? And I think we all find out together sometimes,
Yeah.
but theoretically she is retired, and in 2022 we had a special exhibit that you and Natasha put together for the University of Iowa Libraries, and it was there throughout that fall, and now it still exists as a virtual exhibit that people can go look at now, and I'll put the link in the notes for this episode. Can you talk a little bit about how that happened, your experience of it, things that were interesting to you that you learned?
That was the project that became a pandemic project. Apparently, that was something that I was into. No, so fall of 19, there was a call for proposals for the main library gallery.
Right.
And I forwarded that to Natasha and Chris of, hey, do you want to pitch for the 55th anniversary or do we wait for the 60th?
Right.
And Chris very quickly shot back, go now because who knows where we'll be at the 60th.
Yes.
All right, cool. So Natasha and I put together a proposal that was successful. I really wanted to use that, and I successfully did, as a good excuse to go diving through the IWP records that are held in the University of Iowa Special Collections and Archive, and the Paul Engel papers, Paul being one of the founders of IWP. His papers are also held there and are quite extensive. And are the best documentation of the first 20 years of IWP. And that also led down several side tangents of other collections that are somewhat associated from either people who were involved or whatever. And that's basically how that project happened. It wasn't really derailed at all either by the pandemic, though. I had been planning on going and starting the archival research and prep for the exhibit summer of 20.
Hmm.
And I ended up starting it in fall of 20. So it really wasn't set back much time at all, especially when we had about a 3-year timeline. So yeah, it was about a year or so of going in through these. I mean, because both the Engel papers and the IWP records are massive archival collections. We measure archival collections in linear feet, and the Engel papers are 75 linear feet, so that's shelf space of, and they're not small boxes, they're the big bankers boxes type things, and they're dense and
Right.
heavy.
So a foot represents actually like a box's worth of. So there's depth to that too, right?
Yeah,
We're
yeah,
multiplying
yeah,
those linear feet
yeah.
by what, 36 inches to depth of
Something like
paper?
that. Yeah. I'm not an archivist, and I hope our university archivist doesn't hear this. She'll probably be like, "All right, Lisa, you messed up here." But because some other archives do it in like cubic feet, which
Uh-huh.
is actually kind of a more accurate. But we've done it in linear feet for however long we've had an archive, basically.
Right.
So that's how we count it. And yeah, so a 75 linear foot archive of personal papers is a lot.
Yeah.
And the IWP administrative records is even more. I mean, I knew the structure of those, the structure and the organization of those collections, so I knew kind of where to start and where to go off on tangents and how to kind of guide myself through those. But that basically gave me a really good deep dive into the Engel papers. And this is why Natasha and I could probably do a great pub quiz on IWP and Iowa City international literature. So
Yeah.
is that, yeah, it's very weird getting to know somebody through their archive. I mean, Paul died in 91, and I was 8 years old. So this is somebody who I never could have met
Yeah.
ever. And yet here I am developing an opinion of him through his papers, which is just very, very strange. I spent basically a year with this guy and his papers in the pandemic.
So that
um,
was your closest friend in some ways.
oh man, I spent more time with Paul Engel than most human.
Yeah.
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 That was a very weird year I mean, in many, many ways, but that
Yeah.
was one thing that made it really weird for me. Yeah, so there's a wealth of material there that basically spells out the history of this program. Paul was also an early director of the Writers' Workshop, so there's a lot of that history there as well. I kind of knew I could largely ignore a lot of his paper, thankfully, before about 1964, because most of that was going to be more related to the workshop.
Right.
And, he starts taking some lengthy international trips in the early 60s that kind of start to come together in what became IWP, starting in 67, 68. So yeah, it was a lot to go through. Natasha and I basically worked together for 3 years doing that project. So yeah, I mean, she was one of my closest colleagues really in that time. I was talking to her more than most other people, and that and my two co-editors. So
It was her and Paul.
yeah, I know, right?
Co-editors.
Yeah, so you guys now you know what my pandemic looked like.
That
Basically,
definitely I feel like that could change a person.
it probably did.
I feel I feel like that would shape your personality. It is interesting to try and remember what one was like before and
Oh
to
yeah,
contrast to what one was like after. Such a such a strange such a strange thing. And the
right.
strangest part is that we don't talk about how strange it was.
Yeah, yeah. The great thing about the exhibit was because IWP is such a juggernaut of programming, I didn't have to do any programming. We just came to you guys and said, "What do you guys want to do, and how do you guys want to use the space?"
Yeah.
And the other beauty of it was if we put on a program in that space and told you guys, then all of a sudden 20 people from the residency would show up.
Yes.
And so we had like automatic numbers.
Yeah.
That became actually, I think the record still holds that it was the second most attended exhibit in the time that we've had the main library gallery as a space.
Oh, that's good to know. I
Yeah.
should brag about that in grant documents.
There you
It
go.
it
Yes,
may
you
be too
should.
late for some of them, but I'll find a way.
Yes.
No, that's great. I mean, and the IWP is such an interesting illustrator of the power of network effects. I
Yeah,
unfortunately do not remember the name of the person in the portrait in this story,
I might.
but there was a portrait of a writer on the wall who was friendly with our at the time one of the writers visiting was Gayat Al-Madoun.
You're thinking of the portrait of Khalid Khalifa.
Yes, yes. Oh, and I should know that. I've seen because he died recently, so I've
Yeah.
seen a lot of portraits of him recently. But so while he was looking up at that picture, he got a text.
Right, right.
Gayat did from Khalifa, and so then I have a photo of him pointing at the portrait while holding the phone with the text, and he was so delighted. And there's coincidences and there's things like
Yeah.
that all over the place.
Yeah, I think what's really fun with IWP is it pulls in existing networks. So a lot of writers know folks who have been at this program before them, but then it makes some really interesting networks. One of the things that I do at the beginning of a residency is I pull together a welcome display that is the most recent material that we have in English or the original language from the countries represented in the current residence, in the new residency coming in. I put that on display in the main library, and during the orientation that we do in the library for the residents, we start there. And a lot of them see their friends
Yeah.
in those books. I remember one. I won't even name the country, but somebody looked and was like, "I read that manuscript for a publisher, and we turned it down." And there it is, published in its form by who eventually published it. And I mean, he's a great guy. It's just we
Yeah.
turned it down.
Yeah.
And so you like those networks exist.
Yeah.
They often know each other, but then you end up seeing things that there are certain, if you're taking Latin American literature, there are certain translation networks that are common. A Latin American novel is likely to come out if it's going to get translated German, French, Italian, English. And sometimes even more or less in that order. But every now and then you see a novel come out in a language that is not usual for it to get translated into.
Yeah.
And you're like, that might have been IWP at work.
Yes.
Is that
Yes.
somebody read somebody's, writing sample or whatever, and they were like, this is awesome. I want to hear the rest of it. unfortunately, I can't read it in your original language. Can you give me a copy of your book? Because I know somebody who speaks your language and is
Yeah.
going to, they make it happen.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. There's always this little explosion. I say always. I've been here for 2 years.
yeah.
But my experience has been that after the residency concludes, you'll just get these random clusters of uh, publications of people in a language they have never
Yeah.
ever written and they've never been translated in. It never would have happened otherwise, but it gets published in an online magazine in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yep.
And it's awesome. What
Yeah.
else could you say?
Absolutely. I love it when we get like folks who are publishers, who run small presses or are editors for larger presses back home because they really have those connections and they can absolutely take home a suitcase of books.
Say the World, an international writing podcast, is a production of the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa. IWP programming is primarily funded by the University of Iowa and the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs at the U.S. Department of State, with additional funding provided by organizations like the Doris Duke Foundation, as well as donors like you. If you'd like to donate to the IWP, go to bit.ly/IWP-support. Links to further information and additional credits for this episode are in the show notes.